A silent farewell, or so they thought. The hospital room was dimly lit, bathed in the sterile glow of fluorescent lights. The rhythmic beeping of the monitors provided the only sound, a steady reminder that time was running out. Tom lay motionless on the hospital bed, his once strong frame now frail, his face pale against the soft blue sheets. A man who had once filled every room with laughter and warmth now remained in a coma, suspended in the fragile space between life and death. For months, his family had prayed, hoped, and waited. But now, the doctors had given them the news no family ever wants to hear. There was nothing more they could do. Tomorrow, the machines would be turned off. Kate, his wife, sat beside him, her fingers intertwined with his lifeless hand. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her body heavy with exhaustion. She had spent countless nights by his side, whispering memories, pleading for a miracle. But Tom never stirred. Tonight, before saying their final goodbyes, Kate made one last request. "Bring Max," she whispered to her son Daniel. "He deserves a chance to say goodbye to." A dog's last visit. Max was no ordinary dog. For 7 years, he had been Tom's constant shadow, his best friend, his most loyal companion. A beautiful white Labrador, Max had been by Tom's side through everything. Morning walks in the park, long road trips, lazy afternoons watching football. Even when Tom first fell ill, Max had refused to leave his side, curling up beside him every night, sensing that something was wrong. But when Tom was taken to the hospital months ago, Max was left behind, confused and restless. Now finally, he was being brought to see his owner again, but only to say goodbye. As Daniel led Max through the hospital corridors, the dog walked differently than usual. There was no excited tail wagging, no playful energy. Instead, his steps were slow, deliberate. He knew. When they entered the room, Kate looked up, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. "Come here, Max," she whispered, her voice breaking. Max hesitated for a moment, staring at Tom's still body. Something in his deep brown eyes changed. Normally, he would have rushed forward, jumped up onto the bed, licked Tom's face like he always did. But this time, he didn't. Instead, he walked slowly to the bed, his ears slightly back, his eyes filled with something that looked almost like understanding. Kate placed a trembling hand on his head. "Say goodbye, Max." But Max wasn't ready to say goodbye. He gently pressed his cold nose against Tom's hand, nudging it softly, then laid his head on Tom's chest. And then he just lay there, still, silent, waiting. The air in the room grew heavy. The doctors exchanged quiet glances. One of them cleared his throat. "We'll give you a few minutes." The door clicked shut behind them. Kate swallowed hard, stroking Max's fur. "I wish you could bring him back, buddy," she whispered. Max's ears twitched. And then, something changed. A dog's unspoken message. Minutes passed, stretching into what felt like an eternity. Then, without warning, Max twitched. His ears shot up. His breathing became sharp, alert. Kate noticed it immediately. Max. The dog lifted his head, his nose twitching, as if sensing something the rest of them couldn't. Then, he stood up. His eyes locked onto Tom's face, his tail stiffening, his muscles tensing. And then he barked. Not just any bark, a sharp, commanding, urgent bark. The sudden noise shocked everyone. "Max, quiet." Kate gasped, reaching to calm him. But Max refused to stop. He barked again, and again. Then he let out a low, desperate whimper and pressed his nose against Tom's cheek. The monitors beeped, but this time, something was different. Kate's heart stopped. The heart rate monitor, which had remained painfully steady for days, suddenly flickered. A tiny, almost imperceptible jump. Then another. And another. The weak, fading signal began to strengthen. The doctors rushed back into the room, their expressions shifting from professional detachment to utter disbelief. "What's happening?" Kate's voice trembled. One of the doctors checked the monitors, his eyes widening. His heart rate, it's increasing. Kate's breath caught in her throat. What? Max whimpered again, nudging Tom's face, licking his cheek. And then, Tom moved. It was small, just a twitch of his fingers. But it was enough. Kate let out a choked sob, gripping his hand. Tom. Silence. Then, a soft groan. A ragged, shallow inhale. And then, his eyelids fluttered open. For the first time in months, Tom opened his eyes. The first thing he saw was Max, his faithful friend, gazing at him with pure, unwavering love. And in the weakest, hoarsest voice, Tom managed to whisper one word. Buddy. Kate broke down in tears. The doctors stood there, speechless. Max's tail wagged furiously. He hadn't come to say goodbye. He had come to bring his best friend back. A miracle no one expected. The room felt frozen in time. Kate's breath caught in her throat, her fingers trembling as they clutched Tom's hand. He had moved. He had spoken. For months, the doctors had said there was no hope, that the man who once filled their home with laughter, love, and warmth was gone, his body kept alive only by machines. But now, against all odds, his eyes were open. Not fully aware, not completely back, but there was something. Something no one had expected. Something only Max had sensed. The dog let out a soft, high-pitched whimper, his tail wagging furiously now. He licked Tom's hand, nudging it with his nose as if urging him, "Don't stop. Come back to us." The doctors snapped into action, rushing to his bedside. One checked the monitors, another examined Tom's pupils with a small flashlight, whispering rapidly to his colleagues. Kate clung to her husband's hand, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break. "Tom, can you hear me?" A long pause. Then, a groggy, almost inaudible sound came from his lips. Not quite words, but something. A tear slipped down Kate's cheek. She turned to the doctors, her voice shaking. "What's happening?" One of the physicians, Dr. Reynolds, turned toward her, his eyes wide with disbelief. "This is incredible," he murmured. "His vitals have stabilized. His brain activity is increasing." Another doctor shook his head in astonishment. "This doesn't make sense. We had no neurological response for weeks. But now..." Kate could barely process their words. All she knew was that something impossible had just happened. And it had started with Max, the dog who never gave up. While the doctors worked, Max never left Tom's side. He sat firmly beside the bed, his large golden eyes fixed on his best friend, ears perked up, body poised as if waiting for something more. It was as if he knew that this wasn't over yet. Kate wiped her tears and placed a hand on Max's head. "You knew, didn't you, buddy?" she whispered. Max turned his head slightly, his tail thumping against the floor. He had always been loyal. But this was something more. He had felt what no one else could. Smelled life where the doctors had seen only the end. Heard something in Tom's breathing that no machine could detect. And he had refused to accept goodbye. Kate's chest tightened. "Thank you, Max." He didn't need words to respond. His eyes said it all. I wasn't going to let him go. A battle between life and loss. The next few hours were filled with urgency. Tom was still far from okay. His responses were slow, his movements weak, but there was no denying it. He was coming back. The doctors had started running more tests, whispering among themselves about brain activity, oxygen levels, and neurological responses. None of them could explain it. But one thing was clear. Max's presence had triggered something. A reawakening. A pull from the darkness. Still, it wasn't a miracle just yet. "We don't know the extent of his recovery," Dr. Reynolds admitted. "He's responding, but we have a long way to go." Kate swallowed. "But he's here." The doctor paused, then nodded. "Yes, he's here." It was more than they had ever expected. And that was enough. For now. A memory that changed everything. Later that night, after the doctors had stabilized Tom, after the shock had begun to settle, Kate sat beside him in the dim hospital room. Max lay curled up on the floor, his head resting near the bed frame, his breathing deep and steady. Kate watched Tom's chest rise and fall. He was still asleep, but every so often his fingers would twitch. His lips would part slightly. His head would shift ever so slightly toward the warmth of Max's presence, as if somewhere deep inside he knew. Kate let out a shuddering breath and leaned closer. "Tom," she whispered, "I don't know if you can hear me, but if you can, please, fight. Come back to us." Her voice broke. She blinked back tears and gripped his hand tighter. "We still have so many memories left to make." Then, in the soft silence of the night, Tom did something he hadn't done in months. He gave her the faintest squeeze. Kate let out a gasp, her eyes widening. She turned to Max, who immediately perked up. And in that moment, she knew. Max had never given up on Tom. And now, neither would she. A love that refused to fade. The days that followed felt like a fragile dream, one that could slip away at any moment. For months, Tom had been trapped in silence, lost in a world no one could reach. But now his eyes were open. His fingers twitched. His lips formed small, whispered sounds that weren't quite words yet, but were proof that something had changed. And at the center of it all was Max, the dog who had refused to say goodbye. The dog who had pulled Tom back from the edge. Kate refused to leave his side. She watched every movement, every slow blink, every breath, afraid that if she looked away, this miracle would disappear. But Tom wasn't fading. He was fighting. A silent guardian. Max never left the hospital. The doctors, who at first had been hesitant about allowing a dog in the ICU, stopped questioning it. Because Max was different. He wasn't just a pet. He was a guardian. He slept beside the bed, only lifting his head when Tom stirred. He watched the nurses, his brown eyes alert, as if making sure they were treating his best friend with care. And when Tom's breathing became irregular, or when he struggled to open his eyes, Max knew before anyone else. A whimper, a soft nudge of the nose, a quiet presence that reminded Tom, "You're not alone." Max had always been by Tom's side, and he wasn't going anywhere now. The first word. 3 days after Max had woken Tom, something extraordinary happened. Kate was sitting beside Tom, holding his hand, whispering softly about all the things he had missed, about Liam's soccer game, about the changing seasons, about how much the world had ached for him to return. And then Tom shifted. His lips parted. Kate froze. His voice was weak, hoarse, barely a whisper, but she heard it. "Max." Her heart stopped. Tears immediately burned in her eyes. "Tom," she choked, gripping his hand. But his gaze wasn't on her. It was on Max. The dog had lifted his head instantly at the sound of his name. His tail thumped softly against the hospital floor. And then he stood up, placed his front paws gently on the bed, and licked Tom's hand. It was so simple, so small, but it was everything. Kate covered her mouth, letting out a quiet sob. Max had been the first name Tom had spoken. Not Kate. Not doctor. Not help. Max. Because somehow, in his darkest moments, Max had still been there, pulling him back, waiting for him to return. And now he had. A recovery no one could explain. The doctors were in awe. "This is beyond medical understanding," one of them admitted. "We didn't expect him to wake up. And now, he's forming words." They ran tests. They scanned his brain. They checked every function they could measure. But science couldn't explain it. They could analyze his vitals. They could track his progress. But they couldn't explain Max. Because medicine had given up on Tom. But his dog never had. And sometimes love is stronger than science. The first step. Tom's progress was slow but steady. Every day, He got a little stronger. His hands, once limp and unresponsive, began to squeeze Kate's fingers. His voice, once silent, grew from a whisper to a hoarse, quiet murmur. And then, the biggest test came. The physical therapists arrived. "Are you ready to try sitting up?" one of them asked gently. Tom's eyelids were heavy. His body was weak. For a long moment, he didn't respond. Then Max moved. The dog, sensing the hesitation, stood up and pressed his nose into Tom's palm. A small, encouraging nudge. Kate watched as Tom blinked, and then very slowly nodded. The nurses helped him. It took everything he had. His arms trembled. His breath came in sharp, heavy gasps. But with Max sitting beside him, watching him with unshakable faith, Tom sat up for the first time in months. Kate burst into tears. Max let out a happy, low bark, his tail wagging so fast it blurred. And Tom, for the first time since waking up, Tom smiled. It was weak, small, but it was real. And everyone knew. Tom wasn't just alive. He was coming back. A love that never left. Later that night, as Kate sat beside Tom, she whispered, "I thought I lost you." Tom, his fingers still weak but moving, slowly reached for her hand. "You almost did," he rasped. His voice was fragile but filled with warmth. Kate squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with tears. "What brought you back?" Tom turned his head. His gaze landed on Max. The dog, curled up at the foot of the bed, lifted his head at the sound of Tom's voice. Tom gave a weak chuckle. Him. Kate's throat tightened. Max had been the one who refused to say goodbye. Max had been the one who fought when no one else could. And in the end, it had been enough. Kate stroked Tom's hand, her voice thick with emotion. "He saved you." Tom nodded slowly. "Yeah, he did." Max wagged his tail, resting his head on Tom's legs. And in that moment, nothing else needed to be said. Because some love never fades. Some friendships never end. And sometimes, the strongest hands pulling you back from the edge aren't hands at all. They're paws. A love that defied fate. The day Tom was discharged from the hospital, the entire staff gathered in quiet amazement. Doctors, nurses, and therapists, all who had once prepared his family for the worst, stood at the hallway entrance, watching a man they thought they'd lost walk again. His steps were slow, his grip still weak, but he was alive, awake, and holding Kate's hand. And by his other side, his greatest companion trotted proudly, Max. The dog's tail wagged with an uncontainable joy, his paws moving in perfect sync with Tom's every step. Max wasn't just escorting his owner home. He had won a battle no one else could fight. Coming home. As the front door creaked open, Tom inhaled deeply. The familiar scent of home, wood, coffee, and the faint smell of fresh air from the open windows hit him like a memory wrapped in warmth. Everything was exactly as he had left it. The old leather recliner sat in the corner, the bookshelf stacked with books he had half finished, the kitchen counter still holding the coffee mug he had used on the morning before he collapsed. Kate watched him nervously. "Are you okay?" Tom nodded slowly, his eyes landing on something else. Max had trotted ahead and was sitting in front of the couch, staring at Tom expectantly, ears perked up. Tom chuckled, shaking his head. "You never gave up on me, did you, buddy?" Max's tail thumped against the hardwood floor. And in that moment, Tom knew. This house wasn't just his. It was theirs. Because while the world had waited in doubt, while the doctors had whispered about miracles and science, while even his own body had betrayed him, Max had waited. Max had fought. And Max had never let go. The life they almost lost. The days turned into weeks, and Tom's recovery became a journey of patience, love, and second chances. Each morning, he and Max walked a little farther. Each night, Kate would read him stories of everything he had missed. Each moment, he found himself grateful for things he had once taken for granted. Liam's laugh, the smell of fresh rain, the warmth of Kate's hand in his, and the sound of Max's paws patting across the floor, always close, always watching. One afternoon, as Tom sat on the porch, Max curled at his feet, a familiar thought crossed his mind. "I almost lost this," he murmured. Kate, who was sitting beside him, squeezed his hand. "But you didn't." Tom looked down at Max, running his fingers through his soft fur. "No," he said softly. "Because of him." Kate smiled through her tears. "Yeah, because of him." Max lifted his head at the sound of their voices, his deep brown eyes filled with an understanding beyond words. As if he knew, as if he had always known. The greatest goodbye never said. There had been a time when Max had been brought to say goodbye. A time when the doctors had given up, when the machines had been the only thing keeping Tom alive. But dogs don't understand goodbyes. They only understand love, loyalty, and the belief that the ones they love will always come back. Max hadn't come to let go. He had come to pull Tom back into the world. And somehow, against all odds, he had done it. Not with medicine, not with logic, not with science, but with the purest force in the universe, love. A love so strong, so unwavering, that even fate had been forced to step aside. Because some bonds can't be broken, some friendships don't end, and sometimes when the world says, "It's time to say goodbye," a dog says, "Not yet." This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.